Hi everyone, Dr. Eric Kaufman here, and in this section I'm going to discuss my deal. So we're going to look at the beginning, what I knew, what resources I used. I'll talk about learning about Alibaba, learning about TEF, which is the Ethiopian grain that I used and supplied, finding a supplier and my mistakes, finding a buyer, negotiating a price, interacting with my supplier and the mistakes I did in that, interacting with my buyer and the mistakes I made in that, finding a better supplier, finalizing and closing the deal, my mistakes throughout the whole process, and what I learned, and how this course will turn 8 months of trial and error learning into 1 week. Let's get started. So at the beginning, I knew I wanted to start a business for some supplemental income, and I knew a few things that I needed for the business. It had to be mobile and according to my own schedule. So I needed a business that I could take care of outside of a specific office place. It didn't have to be dependent on location, and I needed it to work with my own schedule. I had a busy schedule at the time, and I still do, and so I needed to be able to make business calls and receive calls whenever I needed to and wherever I may be. So I needed it to be on my own schedule. I looked into stocks, but I realized that I didn't have enough capital to make good income. So if you want to trade stocks safely, you need to have enough capital or starting money to make sure that you can make good gains on less risky investments. So I didn't go into stocks for that reason. One day I was just curious about what the import-export business was. We see it in movies all the time. We see mafia men and mob men standing by shipping containers and shipping yards. But nobody really knows what these people are doing that they're calling an import and export business. So I began researching online and on Google. So what I knew initially about the import and export business is absolutely nothing. Aside from just seeing it in the movies, I had no idea what an import and export business even meant. I didn't know how to register a business. I didn't know how to make a website cheaply and quickly. I knew you could pay somebody a few $1,000s to make it, but I didn't have a few $1,000s to spend on this project at the time. I didn't know the laws and regulations involved, I didn't know the vocabulary at all, and I didn't even know what import and export really meant. So what resources did I use? First of all, I was really inspired to get started after reading a Rolling Stone article called Stoner Arms Dealers, and it's about a 19-year-old and I believe a 23-year-old young man who both decided to start an arms dealing company, who were actually winning military contracts and closing deals worth over $300 million and making huge profits at the same time, all from the comfort of their own apartment while getting high on marijuana at the same time. So that inspired me to get started on my own. If they could do it of all people and in dealing with the government, then I thought I could do it myself as well. So I began learning by just Googling what I needed to know. Googling what is an import and export business, what does import mean, what does export mean, and so forth. I looked at government websites. They gave me a lot of information on how to register a business and information on the laws regarding import and export business. I looked at a lot of how-to guides on the internet. And lastly, and most importantly, I read a book from cover to cover called Import and Export for Dummies. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but this is the book to get started in the import and export business and to have a very good idea of how the import and export business works and how the process works, as well as a lot of samples of documents used and transactions and payments. So it's a great book and a must-read for anybody who wants to get in the import and export business. That, along with this course, will definitely help you be prepared to close that first deal. So after I had an idea of what import and export actually meant, even though I was still fuzzy on a lot of the terms and I was still fuzzy on a lot of the information involved, I began learning about Alibaba. I heard of it on business websites. I'm always hearing that Alibaba grew to this many billions of dollars in revenue, and Alibaba did this and Alibaba did that. So eventually it just stuck in my head. I knew what Alibaba was, but I didn't visit the website yet. Eventually I met with a friend who explained to me how he uses Alibaba to find buyers and sellers of a product and how easy it is, and how he couldn't believe that other people weren't doing it. So he showed me how you can use Alibaba to find buyers. He just gave me a tutorial in a few minutes, and once I got the idea, I started experimenting with myself and just learning how to use it on my own. I still didn't entirely know about the import and export business at this point. I just thought I'd learn as I went. After learning how Alibaba works, I met a businessman at work from Djibouti, and he told me about an exotic grain called teff that has recently gone up in price. What was happening is there was an export ban by the government of Ethiopia from exporting teff. However, Ethiopians outside of Ethiopia still had high demand for the grain because it's a big part of their diet, like rice is to East Asians. So suddenly, the price shot up for any teff found outside of Ethiopia. So this businessman tells me that he can supply me with teff legally through Djibouti, another country next to Ethiopia, if I can find him some buyers. So at this point, I really began to read about the import and export business from Import and Export for Dummies and began experimenting with finding buyers on Alibaba for teff. First of all, I want to talk about finding a supplier, which was my first mistake. I thought to myself, I don't need to find a supplier online since I already had one. And that was my biggest mistake, and it cost me many months of dealing with a poor supplier. I didn't do a background check on him. Since I met him in person, I figured I could just trust him. I assumed he understood the business, which turned out he didn't understand at all. I assumed he had the right certifications and processing facilities. It turns out he was just buying it from farmers, and he didn't have any idea about the certifications or FDA approvals or how to process it. And I assumed he'd be easy to contact whenever I needed him, which he actually was at the beginning. He would always return my text messages and my calls whenever I needed him. However, eventually, within 2 weeks of closing a deal, he just disappeared. I didn't have any backup suppliers. I just assumed that he knew what he was doing, and he told me he could supply me for $1,500 per ton, or $30,000 CIF, any US port, which was a very attractive sell price. So I wanted to look at buyers. So next I decided to find a buyer. I went through every single buy request on Alibaba.com. There were several pages of request after request, and I just went through all of them. Many buyers were either fake or wanted to purchase at an unrealistic price, but I kept going anyway, and eventually I found 3 realistic buyers in the United States. 2 were ordering small quantities and were clearly going to be a headache. Whenever a buyer is ordering small quantities, you have to make sure that you decide for yourself whether it's worth your time or not. So on this last US buyer, I did a background check that was very promising. It showed that it was a legitimate company, and it was actually registered in the state that they're operating in, and they have done business before, and they do buy and sell commodities according to Zeppel.com. Initially, I contacted them through email, and then I switched to phone calls once I got comfortable. Next, it was time to negotiate the price with the buyer. So first of all, we discussed what the product was, how clean it was, what the specifications were. Of course, at the time, I wasn't providing him the right information because my supplier was making guarantees that weren't actually true due to his unfamiliarity with the business. But we started negotiating price anyway, since I was still naive. I knew I was getting a great price compared to the market price, but I still wanted to make a very large profit. So I went in very high and said I'll supply him at $2,800 per ton. The buyer informed me that he was getting it for $1,900, but had limited supply. So I had leverage now, because I could supply him with a product that he needed, but he wasn't even able to source because there weren't enough suppliers. So eventually, after discussing and some back and forth, we settled on a price of $2,120, which is $3,120 over the price that he was getting it for. And this is per ton, by the way. So multiply that by 20 to get the container. So interacting with my supplier, once again back to the supplier, and this is another round of mistakes. I asked the supplier for a sample, and he said it would be there in a week. It would actually be almost 2 months before I would receive the sample, which was a big issue with my buyer. I asked the supplier to register with the FDA. I found out that he doesn't even have a registered company, and was planning on registering once I had finalized the deal. So he didn't even know about FDA registration, and he didn't even have a registered company. I told him to register immediately, and I would follow up with him weekly, and there was always an excuse for why he wouldn't register or get the sample over. One legitimate one was an Air France strike. However, he could have found a way around it, and he eventually settled on Turkish Airlines for shipping after many months of waiting. He would also keep delaying registering the company, and when the sample did eventually arrive, it was not clean enough for retail sales. It needed processing. It was raw, straight from the gardens, straight from the farms, and it wasn't ready to show to my buyer. So now back to interacting with my buyer, which is my third round of mistakes. Instead of finding another supplier, I kept on putting up with the one that I had. I told the buyer that I'd have a sample to him in a week, and it ended up taking over 2 months to actually get the sample over to him. I told him the sample would be cleaned and ready for retail sales, and it ended up being very impure, and it's a very difficult grain to process, so even if I gave it to him raw, it would be difficult for him to find anywhere in the US that even processes it. With that said, the buyer was still ready to make a deal, and I provided him with my sales contract, and he approved, and he was ready to buy 1 container per month at $42,000, $400 per container. The only reason the buyer trusted me at this point was because I was so honest and so open with him, and that I followed up with him regularly, so it's very important to do that. Eventually I decided that I had to find a better supplier, and the reason for that was eventually the worst thing I could imagine happened. Although we were ready to make a deal despite all of the issues, my initial supplier stopped responding to emails and phone calls, and after 2 weeks of attempting to call him and message him, I decided that I had to find another supplier on short notice. So I had a friend that was getting started selling teff as well, and I contacted him to act as a supplier. I wanted my friend to be my supplier since he knew somebody that sold teff. Eventually I dropped him though, because he was not being open to me about numbers, about profit, margins, and revenue and costs, and having him as another broker on the same deal really complicated the paperwork. So having 2 brokers on a single deal really complicates the paperwork. So eventually I decided I should just turn to Alibaba.com and find a supplier through there. At the time, I'd placed my product on Alibaba.com, and I was ranked number 1 for when anybody searched teff. So if anybody went on Alibaba.com and searched teff, I was the number 1 supplier at the time. I looked into the number 2 supplier at the time, and I contacted him about becoming my supplier, as in acting as a broker for him. I ran a background check, which went well. He was already registered with the FDA. He's previously exported to North America, Canada in this case, and was available 24/7. Even if I messaged him at 4 a.m. in the morning, I would have a response by 5. He knew all of the industry standards for grain purity and chemical testing. We agreed on an arrangement in which he would provide me with his price, then I would mark it up, and he would deal with shipping and taking payment, and then would pay me the markup. So for example, if he was selling it at $1,700 per ton, I would mark it up to the $2,100 that I would eventually show to the buyer, and then he would pay me the difference after we closed the deal. We exchanged contracts and established a partnership, but more importantly, this guy seemed very reliable, and eventually we became good friends, and he even invited me over to Ethiopia to his factory and to his farms. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it at the time though. So the new supplier was more expensive. It costed around $1,720 per ton instead of $1,500 per ton, which once scaled is a huge loss. So it made a huge difference to my personal profit at the large volumes being sold. This time it was $34,400 per container. However, since the buyer was buying at $42,400 per container, the profit was still very healthy, around $8,000 per container every month, which is almost unheard of now, and it was just due to the special circumstances of the Ethiopian government's ban on exporting teff. So finalizing and closing the deal, the buyer and the supplier both trusted me very much, but they did not trust each other, and for good reason. The buyer has been ripped off before, and so has the supplier. So because of this, the supplier wanted 10% cash in advance just to load the teff onto the shipping container, and supplied me with a bill of lading. The buyer, on the other hand, was not open to cash in advance from a foreign supplier. He didn't want to pay 10% upfront to a foreign supplier because he's been burned before. We agreed that I would put up the 10% in advance to the supplier, and then 70% of the payment would be paid upon presenting the bill of lading to the buyer. So I would pay the 10% cash advance and receive the bill of lading, and then I would supply the bill of lading to the buyer and he would supply me with 70% of the cash, which immediately went to the supplier. And finally, 30% upon arrival and inspection to the United States. And that's when I would finally receive my 10% advance back. So we also agreed that the product will be inspected before being placed in a shipping container by a third party, and we split the cost between the buyer and the seller. It's common practice when selling agricultural products that they be inspected by a third party company, such as SGS, when being loaded onto the shipping container, to make sure that the product is exactly what the seller is saying it is before the buyer has to commit to anything. And so we split the cost of that inspection. It was around $500. A finalized and signed version of the contract was sent to the buyer, and after around 8 months of hard work and obstacles, the deal was finally completed, supplying TEF at $34,400 per container to a buyer buying at $42,400 per container, and the profit was a little under $8,000 per month after the inspection fees, and the buyer was looking to purchase every single month. So what were my mistakes during this process? First of all, I relied on my first supplier, who I didn't even do a background check on. I did not have multiple suppliers to rely on. I relied only on one. I allowed the process to take many months instead of a few weeks. The deal was supposed to be closed around September or October, and instead was closed in January of the following year. Not pursuing more buyers, since I had a lot of downtime, just waiting for samples and other issues. I could have been pursuing other buyers to close other deals, whether TEF or any other grain or any other product. I took a huge risk by paying the 10% advance, and I should have acted exclusively as a broker, and in the future I will continue to act exclusively as a broker and never put any of my own money down. I went in not knowing how things were done in the agriculture business, which wasted a lot of time in terms of how inspections work and how to initiate them and how much they cost. So what did I learn? I learned to always run a background check. Absolutely always run a background check so you know exactly who you're dealing with. And we've discussed that in a previous session. I learned to expect the unexpected and always have a plan B after my supplier mysteriously disappeared and never made contact with me, even to this point. I learned not to be lazy and learn everything about a business and product before getting involved. It can save you time, money, and many headaches. I learned to have a reliable and serious buyer, as that makes the process much smoother and easier. Don't let any deal take too long. The longer a deal takes, the less likely it is to happen, although you don't want to rush it. So have a lot of patience for when it does take long. Don't deal with other brokers because it's a huge conflict of interest. Instead of providing a good price, the other broker has to mark up the product's price, and eventually it's just a mess of paperwork, high prices, and people that don't want to deal with each other. And finally, always be honest and open, and that's absolutely key to being trusted in the import and export business, and trust is the fundamental aspect of any import and export business. Finally, turning 8 months into 1 week. What you learned in this course is what I learned over 8 months it took to complete this deal. This will hopefully take an 8-month learning process filled with trial and error and turn it into a lesson you could go through over the course of a week and hopefully have a much smoother first deal in your import and export business. Thank you.